for us, it's always about perspectives in this space. And as many of you are aware who work with us, we started investigating the space of spirituality and its role in human performance many years ago. And we stayed at a fairly sort of top-line level. We knew some of the ancient wisdoms around grace, breathing, mindfulness, meditation, all these tools that we could drag from the sort of masters of their craft through the centuries had direct application, and we've incorporated them over and over again with great success with our teams and our athletes and the people we work with. I think what's important is that we've done some investigation, some science, sort of looking at the reasons why it has impact, and we've touched on some big picture concepts, which speak mainly to this idea of high performers. We see a positive trend towards people who do things for a value bigger than themselves. Family, friends, country, your God, whatever it may be. This idea that you're engaged in what you love, you become great at it, and there's a higher purpose. And that's about the level we've taken it to. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is going to show us how little we really have done in this space and how much more there is to learn and understand. Mr. Michael Salonius.
Is that my button?
That's the button, the big one.
The big one. Cool. Oh, there's my image. My name is Michael Salonius. I am a clinical chaplain. And look at all you fucking people, man. I'm telling you, this is the second time Andy's asked me to speak, and this is not my normal jam. So I'm going to fully disclose that I feel like a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. I'm going to look at you some more and increase my social anxiety. Yes. So that image you're looking at, in clinical chaplaincy and spiritual care, not a lot of people are even aware that there is such a thing as clinical chaplaincy, and I'm not even going to talk about that right away. I'm going to come back to that. I was asked briefly to give you a little background. Why chaplaincy, and where is the intersection between spirituality and health outcomes? So the work for me started a long time ago. And there's no way to do this without uncomfortably sharing some personal narrative, but ultimately I think that everything is narrative and story. As a matter of fact, Brene Brown, our wonderful doctor of sociology who describes certain things that I want to talk about much more eloquently than I ever will, talked about stories, and that really stories are data with a soul, right? Data with a soul. And I really do believe that pretty much everything that we're doing is nothing other than sharing narratives, stories of which we're framing around things that we believe. And the problem with that is a lot of the things the likelihood is that at some point in your life you've been an asshole. And you're an asshole because you believe what you think, right? That's funny. Haha. But it's true. Right? If I have a belief that my significant other is wrong and I am right, I will engage in furious, emotional-driven argument with her. However, as is often the case, I find out that the story that I have believed to be the case is not accurate, and then I am the asshole again. So let's start with a story. So I ran away from home, and it was the 1980s in the Los Angeles punk rock scene. And it was a real intense place to be able to get to explore one's identity. And I found myself being of fair-skinned and homeless, needing protection. And the only gangs that were available in the 80s to fair-skinned folk like me were these punk gangs. So I got indoctrinated into one of these punk gangs. And it was interesting because I remember, I had the image, and if there's any present law enforcement, my apologies for what I'm about to say. I remember I grew up with that belief that ultimately cops were good, and if you did good, you got good. And I heard people saying, like, if you go to a punk show, things are going to get really violent, the cops ruin things. And I remember thinking, like, that's probably a little sensational. But I remember 1986, my first Black Flag show. I remember very adamantly a scene like this happening, where the band was playing and the LAPD rolled in, and there was just kids dancing aggressively, but nothing really harmful. And they said, you guys have to vacate. And that was cool. I remember Henry Rollins at the time, he grabbed the mic, he passed it over to the cop. And we all started to leave because, look, I mean, you're 13 years old, you're skinny, right? You want to be a badass, so you wear badass shit, but deep down inside, you're just a chicken shit. And then that's when the Billy Club started to swing. And that's the outcome of one of those shows. So that's me. And that's actually my mugshot, right? Check that out. So in short time, because this escalation with cops was intense in the LA scene, certain people were known to cause some public destruction. They might have put pipe bombs underneath cars that might be black and white. And certain people were picked up for criminal charges like terrorism and conspiracy to commit terrorism. Well, I was fortunate because I had an extremist for a father who taught me how to make pipe bombs, right? So I didn't need any specialized training, but a lot of the crew that I ran with did. And it was really interesting because we got moved into this area down in Fontana, right? And our gang was racially diverse, right? It was actually founded by a Mexican punk rocker. But this particular compound where we were getting trained in all this cool stuff, right, was uniquely pale-skinned, right? If you look at me, I mean, I don't necessarily look totally Caucasian. Needless to say, if this doesn't give it away, I'm a Hebrew. It turned out that we were at a white supremacist compound, and the place was run by one of the heads of one of the larger white supremacist organizations. And so when I finally got picked up for that terrorism charge, for possibly vandalizing police cars with improvised explosives, I wasn't treated kindly, right? And the good news was I was picked up at a high school, or a junior high school as the case was, and there was no report of me responding aggressively. So 24 hours later, when my parents were finally called to pick me up, and that was the case, I had some bargaining power in how I got to plea out of a terrorism charge. But needless to say, and the end result where I'm going with this, is that 13 facing some serious charges and not ratting endeared me to that white supremacist culture. At which point I remember we were taken aside and I was told, hey, look, we want to groom you for leadership, And I remember saying, like, oh, like, I can't goose step with you guys because I'm a Jew, which in retrospect was the wrong fucking thing to say. Because in very short time afterwards, in a few hours later, a dude named Sean with 2 metal plates in his forehead, big skinhead dude, proceeded to repeatedly stab me. And that was an intense experience. That was my first exposure to really savage human violence, right? And I survived that. And the people who saved me were fellow gang members. And I remember having the awareness that despite what our culture says about those gangs and those symbols that they think are anathema, they saved my life. And I didn't have a family. I didn't have a system in place to hold me up. It was that gang, and it was those bad people doing bad things that saved my life. And it really taught me a very valuable lesson, that oftentimes what we think is culturally positive could in fact be really toxic. And that the belief that we have about things might actually determine whether or not we're going in the right direction. I'm gonna pause on this narrative because the people who spoke in front of me spoke eloquently about technology, and I don't know, man, that's some weird shit, putting shit in your brain, Like, but I have to say that I was taught, and I think it is also the case, that progress for progress's sake is the ideology of a cancer cell. I'm going to repeat that again. Progress for progress's sake is the ideology of a cancer cell without some kind of inherent meaning, without some really embedded sense of purpose and value and belonging. What does that drive? What is the outcome? Is there a goal for that? I don't know. You know, there was that image of like people working on an economy, and then there was those machines driving the economy. And I have to ask, like, are we here to serve an economy? Or is an economy here to serve humanity? You know, I have an opinion on that. You know, I hope yours is in alignment with mine. Anyway, so that was the outcome. And I didn't realize that this is what I was looking for. So the work that I do, clinical chaplaincy. Oh, and I should also bother to say that over the next few years, the way that I responded to that assassination attempt was to become a founding member of an anti-racist gang that has since spread, actually, a little globally. And that might sound cool, but the result was I still have repeated assassination attempts, the most recent one, 2008, by a skinhead gang here in Los Angeles. So the effect of that is long enduring. In short time after, in the late 80s and early 90s, those neo-Nazi groups went ahead and systematically assassinated my closest childhood friends. And I'm going to come back to that because I want to explain this image. For those of you who are unfamiliar, you know, this is some of the oldest human culture. This is one of the oldest cave paintings, and I think it's remarkable that the symbolism used is something that is universal and yet individual. You know, everyone's hand is similar and yet unique. The organization that I helped found is called the Sparta Project. Sparta is an acronym for Spiritual Process and Resiliency Training. If you're not aware of the statistics, 22 veterans commit suicide every day. The VA tried to make it 20. I say, fuck you. You know, if there's any VA people here, I'm sorry. I get the leftovers of what disservice that is in. And so what our organization does is we provide a 5.5-day retreat for people who have previous suicide attempts or who have active plans. And let me frame this into a larger context. 22 suicides a day. If we put our T1, our time one factor at 9/11, and granted, not all those suicides are post-9/11 vets. A lot of them are the Vietnam vets. But if we look at the amount of suicides since 9/11, we can, on a conservative estimate, say that's roughly 115,000 deaths to suicide since 9/11, as opposed to the 8,000 combat casualties. Really frame that. 8,000 combat casualties as opposed to over 100,000 deaths from suicide. And the folks here want to talk about trauma as though it's some reductionist model that if we could flip a switch in the brain, these fuckers will feel better. Bullshit. Bullshit. Because at the heart of suicidality is a real search for meaning. A search for who am I in this place? And I can say with, I think, great certainty that one of the difficulties veterans feel when they come back from war, when they come back from a unit that values honor and purposefulness, and they're thrown into an environment where the goal is to get a fucking Audi, right? Where you actually improve your chances of survival by cutting off your colleagues at the knee, right? Which is anathema in military life. How does that emotional internal environment relate? So one of the things that we do at the Sparta Project is we take 12 warfighters. First day, I give them an introduction into vulnerability and meditation. It's a meditation-based program. We start every day with meditation. We conclude every day with meditation. And there's different taxonomies of meditation that go far beyond the scope of this conversation, but needless to say, I tinker with the work of Dr. Andrew Newberg, who's done a lot of neuroimaging out of the University of Pennsylvania, who looks at different types of meditation and how they produce measurable outcomes in the brain. And so I work with stress reduction and mindfulness. Because being mindful of being agitated, let's say I'm a warfighter and I'm suffering from post-traumatic stress and agitation and I'm sitting for 20 minutes just feeling how miserable I am, well, that's not going to result in a positive outcome now, is that? It's going to be even a more agitated individual. So I tend to believe that meditation for this demographic needs to go through a process of de-escalation in order to tolerate mindfulness. But mindfulness is really important because those aspects of empathy and compassion that some of the presenters before me have talked about in the prefrontal cortex, specifically the areas of the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which really work with empathy and compassion, and similarity versus dissimilarity, well, those improve with mindfulness. So we start every day with mindfulness, we conclude every day with mindfulness. And the vulnerability piece is really important because when you take a bunch of tattooed, tough guys, right, we've been taught, don't be vulnerable. Don't talk about how you feel. Don't get up in front of a group of people and say, I am afraid of talking in front of you, because that is weakness. But here's the thing about this, is that if I selectively choose to repress fear, then I also am repressing joy. I can't selectively repress feelings, right? And so as a result, by training myself, first as a dude in this American environment where, you know, the first time I caught a ball and it hit me in the face and I started to cry, what did my dad say? I'll tell you what my dad said. Jesus fucking Christ, Michael, I'll give you something to cry about, right? So what did I learn? Don't cry. Feel me? And then, in the gang world, when I got jumped in, well, not only was I not allowed to cry, but if I didn't fight back and stand up for at least 10 seconds, I wouldn't have survived. And then later on, when my search for proving what a man I was sent me to Israel to learn about war in the West Bank, I learned that training really suppresses the most human aspects of who I am, at the very least. And so in that essence of suppression, we spend the next day, day one of our retreat, doing what we call mythopoetics, which is grounded in Jungian depth psychology. And this is an image of Carl Jung's Red Book, and I wanted to put it because I totally don't understand what the fuck this is. And I don't think Carl did either, but one of the things that's powerful to me is that there is a dude who is slightly human. He's got extra arms, which is common of mythological images. There's something significant and round in the middle, and we know from the period of the Mycenaean culture where we went from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, bulls and horns became really prevalent as we went from hunter-gatherers to agrarian and pastoral culture. And I think there's some gold in them Nar Hills to investigate a little bit. But below this kind of solar disk meaning thing lying in the emotional collective of these oceanic feelings within us lies something scary, and you know it to be true. Because you can dismiss the dreams all you want. You have nightmares like I have nightmares, and we wake up scared and we want someone to hold us. And it's terrifying. And it can be as simple as a light switch in a dream that triggers a cascade of terrifying emotions. And no amount of reductionism is going to take away the feeling. So we spend day one sharing our stories within a context of a larger story. We walk a labyrinth. This is a cool labyrinth, right? For those of you who can't read Hebrew, that says Jericho in the middle, right? And the Crusaders used the labyrinth at Chartres. I can't pronounce it. Chartres, right? I can say it like a Hebrew, Chartres. But anyway, we walk a labyrinth because we introduce ritual space. And ritual space is different than secular space because it is absolutely pregnant with meaning. And meaning is very valuable for those of us who are suffering. One other thing about a labyrinth. It's different than a maze. Mazes have ways to confuse and to get lost. While it seems like that is the case, a labyrinth has one way in and one way out. And we actually know that when schools put a labyrinth on the blacktop and Johnny ADHD can't sit still, which, by the way, you know what another term, at least from my vantage point, ADHD, we could call that being a boy, right? Because what the Industrial Revolution effectively did is it took fathers out of the home and put boys in situations where they were no longer in conjunction with an older man and entered into an environment that was completely dissimilar. And I'm not minimizing the role of feminism any shape or form. I'm just simply saying is that one of the reasons why I believe masculinity can be so harmful to feminism is that men don't know what nurturing masculinity is. And that isn't going to come from the psychology. It's going to come from some sense of exposure to something that is powerful, like a parallel process. And what I mean by that is that there is something significant about human culture, right? When I was preparing to talk to you, human beings, Homo sapiens, had only been around for 200,000 years. Well, something happened this week, and now they're saying it's 300,000 years. It's amazing how that can happen overnight. But we see, ooh, look at that. This is an image of Enkidu wrestling Gilgamesh, right? The wild man. This wild man image is incredibly powerful because it demonstrates a huge transition in the collective unconscious of embedded human symbols, right? For example, and if you don't believe me about that, wolves and ravens, yeah? They have a bad rap in Grimm's fairy tales and modern myth. But if we go back into the Paleolithic mythology, ravens and wolves are great things because they signify sources of food, yeah? When we're out hunting and gathering, the symbols of the world in which we're interpreting that validate what's useful and what's not useful determine healthy outcomes. And those healthy outcomes in a Paleolithic world don't necessarily conform with what we think ought to be or should be. And so when we begin to investigate the transition from a hunter-gatherer culture to a culture that is dependent upon pastoral, raising cattle, and farming, well, now, when a wolf or a raven signified that there was food over there that we could possibly scavenge, now it says a raven or a wolf, it's going to come and take what's mine. And so we see a transition. Some of those holdouts are like if you've ever read those Norse myths, you know, Odin with his two wolves, Freke and Geri, and Hunin and Munin, that are symbolic. And there's even a tension in the Norse mythology about the role Odin has. And again, it far escapes our talk here. But that this image of the wild man, the outcome in the Epic of Gilgamesh is that Mesopotamia couldn't survive without entering into a relationship with that older, wild, primitive self. That there is something out there that needs to be reconciled. Gilgamesh didn't win. And as a result of this fructifying encounter, grain, surplus. But here's the outcome of surplus. The outcome of surplus is the oldest word for war, the Proto-Semitic word for war, which is milchama. Its root, its three-letter system of etymology, comes from the word bread. There were words for conflict, violence, aggression, but the actual organized mechanistic form of war didn't occur until bread. Because we know that once we could store surplus, we had disadvantage. And if I have more and you have less, eventually someone's going to come and want to take more. And so out of bread comes war. Out of lechem comes milchama. And again, to understand that the world that we occupy comes from this older primitive world that we have very little understanding, and that this is embedded in us. It's embedded in you, it's embedded in me. The search might not be out there, it might be in here. The last symbolic slide. In our 5-day retreat, they spend a day with me doing this weird depth psychology, chaplaincy, spiritual shit. Day 2, they do experiential and adventure therapy with a gentleman who you're going to be introduced to later. Day 3, they have equine therapy. Day 4, psychoeducation on the origins of trauma, how it manifests in the brain. And day 5, we do kind of a repeat of that first day, but you know, a lot of this progress without purpose. This image comes from an article I read back in early 2000. It was from the New York Times. It was called Free Will, Now You Have It, Now You Don't. Some of you might be familiar with that article. It basically was exploring the notion that a lot of this sense that we have of being free-willed, free agent creatures is actually inaccurate, that a lot of our decisions are made below the conscious level prior to us having them. But what struck me is that this image kind of sums up so much of what I think is going on, right? This is a tiger with a monkey holding a steering wheel, right? And you and I are the monkey. And this monkey thinks it's in control. As a matter of fact, it's not just facing the tiger's ass. Its vision is limited to a real myopic perspective. But who's in charge of this? Man, the fucking tiger, right? This monkey is not in control. And so how I believe the role of spirituality plays in healing, first are war fighters. Because at the end of the day, I can watch a person take medications that effectively soothe the central nervous system, discharge somatically things that make them feel agitated. But I know for me, that if being exposed to human suffering on such a massive level, which is so crippling, makes me want to put a gun in my mouth and pull that trigger. There has to be something that reassembles this core identity in such a way that it might not necessarily make sense of that intense human suffering, but frames it within a context that allows me to feel some degree of value confronting it in a way that normalizes my experience vis-a-vis you, so that these experiences aren't some alienating thing that keeps me this tattooed freak on the periphery, and right in the center, comfortable speaking with people about subjects that are a little bit esoteric but ultimately resonate, because I can look at some of your faces and I know that you are feeling something that is similar to what I am feeling right now, which is a need for connection. We are wired for connection. We are wired for struggle, but we are totally wired for connection. The organization's the Sparta Project. There's our logo. I was told to throw in a little ask, you know. So here's my ask. We're free for every warfighter, for every veteran, but we're entirely dependent upon donations. So I have pamphlets. So afterwards, find me, I'll give you one. But if you don't want to, here's also the information that we have out there. It's thespartaproject.org. And of the 400, and I know this is anecdotal, in the last 5 seconds I'll say, we've had about 400 warfighters go through our collective curriculum. Of those 400 who have had previous suicide attempts or an active plan, we've had 0 suicides. Now, I know that's anecdotal. I know that's anecdotal, but I think that we're on to something. You know, the need to be really real and really seen and really felt and really heard is a spiritual process. Last thing I'll say, and I'll end it, is that Jiddu Krishnamurti says it's no measure of good health to be well adapted to an extremely sick society. I don't believe we traumatized folk are sick. I think the culture is traumatizing, and we're the healthy ones. Thank you.
Thank you.